In the days of steam engines, Ireland generally built its own locomotives or contracted the work out to Dubbs and Nielsen or Bayer Peacock and Company in Manchester. Other English companies also tried their hand in making Irish locos, but the point was that it was either British or Irish locomotive manufacturers in the days of steam. There were a few exceptions to this. Most notably, you had the sugar puff locomotives that were built for the Irish Sugar Company in the 1930s, which were built by Ornstein and Koppel in Germany, and the Cork Bandon and South Coast Railway Baldwin 062Ts, which were a complete disaster. During and for many years after the emergency, Ireland didn't have any coal, which greatly impacted the railways. The newly formed CIE began experiments with diesels with the 1000 class shunter, which were Inchicore designed but made with Maybach engines and brush-type motors. Here we see one being built alongside the other experimental locomotive built by CIE, the 1100 class. These were built with a Sulzer engine and intended to replace the Cork-Dublin mainline locos. However, they couldn't really push off the steam. 1953 saw the arrival of the virtually identical to the GNRI AEC railcar types. These were a fantastic success, and following their success, CIE wanted to dieselise its entire fleet, citing the problems with getting coal as a reason for this. Oliver Bulleid, CME of CIE at the time, is said to have wanted to go with General Motors. However, his opinion was overruled due to political reasons at the time, and they went with Metropolitan Vickers. 60 1200 horsepower A-class locomotives were ordered, and 34 550 horsepower C-class locomotives were ordered. These locomotives came with promise, but would flop immensely. The engines were horrible. Two-stroke engines, which left oil everywhere, were incredibly unreliable and, worst of all, were underpowered for their work. Some still to this day claim that the C-class and its unreliability issues closed a lot of the branch lines that it was built to serve, leaving the C-class without work until the late 1960s. However, CIE simply had to persist with them. For their next order of locomotives, they would look towards EMD, and 15 GL8 type single-ended cab locomotives were purchased. These were an immediate hit. They did not have the unreliability issues that their English brothers had, and could haul very heavy express trains and light branch line trains. Following the success of the 121 class, once again, immediately, CIE looked towards EMD. 37 new 141 class locomotives would arrive soon after. These locomotives were virtually identical to a 121, but had two cabs, which allowed for much faster running around time. Many consider these to be the best locomotives ever bought. A testament to how good they were was that CIE purchased a couple more of them in the 1960s. Known as the 181 class, they were the exact same, but with a slightly more powerful engine. The B101s were basically an evolution of the Sulzer locomotives. These were a solid upgrade on the 1950s variant with the same Sulzer engine, built in Britain instead of Ireland. However, these locomotives would be displaced by General Motors power. The E-Class was a range of Inchicore-built Maybach engine shunters. The E401 class and E421 class were just both slightly different variants of each other. The G601 and 611 range were shunting locomotives bought in by dykes. However, these locomotives would actually find themselves working light branch lines and even passenger workings. The K-Class was a class of one, which was inherited from the GNR when CIE took over half of that company in 1958. CIE also possessed two narrow gauge classes, the 501 Walker railcar class, which were very similar to the Donegal counterparts, and the F-class diesel locomotive. The mere existence of these types showing that CIE was even willing to modernise its narrow gauge system. CIE were still very unhappy about their previous altercation with the Crossley-engined A-class. They reckoned, however, it was just an engine problem, and if they could get engines off of EMD to put inside the A-class, they would have a very solid loco. EMD, however, were unwilling to play ball, considering that they didn't want to be associated with the A-class disaster, and generally preferred to sell entire locomotives, not just the engine. CIE then experimented with putting Maybach engines inside two C-class types. Following this, General Motors, EMD, sent over all the relevant engines for all of these classes. Thankfully, the new engine completely transformed these locomotives into, some would even say, better locos than the ones that GM made all by themselves. So, when CIE needed some new locomotives in the mid-1970s, they were considering opting to re-engine the Sulzer types. However, with CIE looking to have 90 mile per hour running on the main line, this wouldn't be possible, and so new locomotives would be required. The 071 class, as they were known, were a complete monster compared to the other Irish types. They had almost twice the horsepower of the re-engined A-class. These locomotives had a bit of a rougher start, however, having bogie crack issues and suspension issues throughout most of its early life. Once these issues were solved, however, they were once again deemed an incredibly solid locomotive. Still running in 2025, with almost 50 years in service, they've proved to be an enthusiast favourite. NIR also purchased 3 of these locomotives for their own Dublin-Belfast 90 mile per hour running. They are still in operation in 2025, however, they've been restricted to 40 miles per hour due to their condition. NIR would also buy 2 of the next class that Irish Rail would buy. With most of the locomotive fleet dating from the 1960s and the newest locomotives dating from the late 70s, Irish Rail, a brand new subsidiary since CIE had split its operations between Bus Eireann, Dublin Bus and Irish Rail, decided to buy 32 new locomotives. The 201 class are the latest locomotives that have been purchased by Irish Rail and still work to this day. Like the 071s, these suffered from a couple of issues too. However, no mechanical issue could quite compete with the biggest issue the 201s had to compete with. When Irish Rail ordered the 201s, they also ordered a series of rail cars from Tokyo Car in Japan. Irish Rail had been working at this stage on a purely loco-hauled basis, with even the smallest of passenger trains being comprised of usually a locomotive, some carriages and a steam heating van. The 2600s would be an immediate success, and following this, pretty much all of the earlier GM types were replaced with rail cars, and the work that the 201s were bought in to do dried up, between the freight being lost and passenger services being turned from loco-hauled to railcar operated. Following the purchase of the ICR 22000 class from Hyundai and Tokyo Car in 2007, some 201s began to be stored, as the Mark IIIs that they were used to hauling were now being withdrawn in favour of these ICRs. The 201s are still in service today, their main duties being on the push-pull services between Dublin and Belfast and Dublin and Cork. They can also be seen on freight. However, it's important to note that due to the weight of these locomotives, the 071s are much handier for this use. That's why all 18 of the 071s, nearly 50 years old, are still in service, while 10 of the newer 201 types remain mothballed at Inchicore Works in Dublin.